what was your most valuable experience throughout like everything that you've done? If you can pick one.
Well, in a certain sense, I would say joining the Jesuits. I have to have two things, I think. Joining the Jesuits and the liberation process that I went through in my mind and heart, as I described, to join, to decide to want to join, and to apply, and then to be accepted. Probably the Chicago 15 action. You know, I mean, I would say that was significant. It has marked my life. I don't talk about it that much because, not because I'm ashamed of it by any means, but it's so strange in a way. You know, for a lot of people, it's too much to lay on people. In Nicaragua, I talk about it with some people, but for me, it was an extremely important decision. And I've never boasted about it. I don't know of anybody in these actions, we call them the actions, who regrets. There are probably a few, but who regrets doing that. So now we're celebrating 50 years, 50th anniversary, something to celebrate. Just one thing I wanted to mention too. There's another blessed who is, I think, he's on the process of canonization, which means being declared a saint officially by the Roman Catholic Church. An Austrian peasant, Austrian farmer, by the name of Franz Jägerstätter. Franz Jägerstätter, this could be an interesting study also. Now, he did, you might say, civil disobedience, but because he felt absolutely obliged to. Hitler had taken over Austria and was conscripting Austrian men into his army. And so for him, it was not a question of effectiveness in a sense. You know, as I mentioned before, I think effectiveness is extremely important. Otherwise, we're just spinning our wheels and we're not doing much for the people who are suffering the injustices that we're trying to combat. But for him, it was faithfulness to his conscience. And his pastor, the parish priest, I think the bishop was, no, friends, you have to go. There can be some instances like that, where somebody just has to do something or has to refuse to do something. And it's out of faithfulness to God, faithfulness to his conscience.
On the flyer it says you're going to talk about Father Carney, and I don't really know much about that. Could you talk about him?
Father James Carney, who took the name Guadalupe to kind of identify with the people of Honduras. He went to the University of Detroit. He studied engineering, and he was a Jesuit working in Honduras. And he was an organizer of peasant unions and human rights organizations. Very dangerous things to be doing. And for that, he was thrown out. He was deported from Honduras. So he lived for about 4 years in Nicaragua, where revolutionary Nicaragua, that is, he was kicked out of Honduras in 1979, and he stayed in Nicaragua until 1983. But he said, we have to work for this kind of change in Honduras. His heart was always in Honduras. So he left the Jesuits because he decided to become a chaplain to an armed revolutionary group of Hondurans who were sort of based in Nicaragua. There weren't that many of them. But he left the Jesuits so as not to drag the Jesuit order into something that he was going to do. Because we were being accused of being involved in armed revolutionary movements. So he and his, well, we can't really have a Jesuit, doing that as a Jesuit. So he left the Society of Jesus. And went into Honduras, and they were just wiped out. I mean, they didn't have much of a chance, and we don't know exactly what happened. The government said they don't know anything about him. He probably starved to death in the mountains. But there have been reports of eyewitnesses who say, no, they saw him in jail in this region of the country where they had entered and where they were confronted by the Honduran military. Somebody says he saw Father Carney in jail, alive. And a few others have said that too. We've never really found out for sure, and we've never found his remains. There's another action of civil disobedience. You might think all I do in my life is commit civil disobedience. Not true. I've only done 4 or 5 major actions over many, many years. But this one was, we had a sit-in, common U.S. type of civil disobedience action, a sit-in. We did that at the U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras, in 1997. And a brother of Father Carney was there. Bishop Gumbleton, Tom Gumbleton of Detroit, was there. He didn't do the sit-in because his job was to deal with the press outside the embassy. But a cousin of Father Carney, and as I said, his brother, myself, we sat in the vestibule, the doorway of the U.S. Embassy in Honduras. Why? Because the U.S. government was releasing a lot of information, supposedly declassified. They were releasing thousands of pages, the State Department, the CIA, the DIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency. But half the material was blacked out. In one of I have a couple of videos on it, and you can see, sometimes whole pages are completely blacked out. These are the pages that the U.S. government releases. So they're clearly covering up a lot, and we think that what they're covering up is mainly some sort of wink of approval that was given by the CIA or by the U.S. Army people or by somebody in the embassy. It's kind of a wink of approval to the Hondurans to do whatever they wanted with Father Carney. Father Carney was not a good American as far as the U.S. Embassy was concerned. So we had to sit in. We said, well, we're sitting here until you have a serious and substantial declassification, a real declassification of these documents. His book is very, very interesting, very straightforward. It's called To Be a Revolutionary, his autobiography. It's very interesting. It shows him as a kind of a traditional Catholic. He was in the Army. He was in the U.S. Army at the end of World War II. But it shows his process of change because of contact, because of his contact. And then he just became a revolutionary in the sense that, revolutionary, there are many different meanings of revolutionary, but he became that and he was a chaplain to the armed struggle group. I've always felt a special responsibility for what my government does. I've never tried to give it up. Some people try to give up their U.S. citizenship to become a citizen of another country. I never felt any desire to do that. Because as U.S. citizens, we are powerful. At least that's what the majority of people in the world think, and I think there's some truth to it. Even individually, but more so when we're organized and struggling and demonstrating and writing letters to Congress and getting people elected and whatever. We are powerful as citizens of this country. Not as powerful, none of us here is as powerful as the big lobbyists in Washington, obviously. But we are the people. And I think we have a responsibility for what our government does in our name. To some extent, this is still a democracy. And democracy means rule by the people. So that was why I was interested in what my government was doing, what they had done to my friend. I knew him somewhat, not real well, but I knew Father Carney somewhat. And what my government was covering up.
I happen to know that you're the author of a book about the Jesuit martyrs?
That brings up another one of my few civil disobedience actions, but the book is called The Jesuit Martyrs of El Salvador, Celebrating the Anniversaries. Again, that term celebrating. I mentioned before that we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of these draft board actions, and we speak of celebrating the anniversaries of the martyrdom of 6 Jesuit priests and 2 women at our Jesuit University in El Salvador. Celebrating. Well, yes, because you celebrate their love, you celebrate their struggle, their commitment, their generosity, their compassion, their solidarity with the people, their courage. And, but they were brutally massacred by the Salvadoran Army, Special Forces Battalion of the Salvadoran Army, in 1989, because they were critics of the regime. They were critics of the Salvadoran regime. Archbishop Romero was killed in 1980, so all during that decade, there was war in El Salvador. Many, many people were killed, including quite a few priests, 4 sisters from the United States, religious sisters, well, 3 religious sisters and 1 lay woman, a lay missioner, Jean Donovan, were killed, brutally murdered in 1980, the same year that Romero was killed. They were killed in December of 1980. So the Jesuits were wiped out by the Salvadoran Army, but who had been trained by the U.S. and equipped by the U.S. There was substantial U.S. support for the Salvadoran Army, which was repressing the people all over the country. That's why Romero said, stop the repression, and no soldier is obliged to obey an unjust order. Of the 6 Jesuits, they were laid out in 6 caskets in the chapel of the university, and the 2 women who had been killed just because they were in a certain wing of the house. This lady had worked for the Jesuits, and her 15-year-old daughter, they were both machine gunned to death because they were in the building. They were in a different wing of the building where the Jesuits were. So that was an extremely powerful experience for all of us. And here again, I'm thinking, as a U.S. citizen, what do I do? Just cry here and hang around and go back to Nicaragua and just talk? No, I said, I have to go to Washington. That's where I belong. So I talked to my Jesuit brothers. I said, I don't think I'm going back to Nicaragua. I got to go directly to Washington, talk to my friends. I talked to Phil Berrigan, who was mentioned in one of these, in part about the Baltimore and the Catonsville actions. And so we got an action together at the White House, which we did in early, I think it was January 5th, 1990. And we had a lot of people demonstrating in front of the White House, and Phil Berrigan and I threw some blood, some of our own blood, which a nurse had taken out of us, a little bit of our blood, and some of the blood actually that was of the martyrs, because a Dominican priest, Father Jim Barnett, who was living in El Salvador at the time, picked up some of the earth, some of the ground from the garden where they were shot. They were all pretty much shot in the head. And he had picked up some of that earth and brought it. We came back on a plane together from El Salvador a couple of days after the funeral. So we used that and we put that on the gateposts, the front gateposts of the White House. Because the U.S. had a substantial degree of responsibility for that massacre, through training the Salvadoran troops who carried it out. I mean, they trained all the Salvadoran troops. And one contingent, the Atacatl battalion, a special forces battalion of the Salvadoran, had done the massacre. But trained by the U.S., supplied by the U.S., financed largely by U.S. military aid. So we figured, well, we got to do something to show where the responsibility, show where a considerable portion of the responsibility for this massacre lies. So we did that. We put the blood on the gateposts, and we were arrested and just spent the night in jail, basically, the DC jail. They remain a source of inspiration for many people. I didn't know them real well. I had met two of them. On a visit once in San Salvador, I had accompanied one of the Jesuits, Father Juan Ramon Moreno, to a mass that he was celebrating at the parish church. We talked a little bit. And another one had been in Nicaragua, but before I got there, he had worked in Nicaragua. But that was a devastating experience, you know, for all of us. Actually, the killing of those 6 Jesuits and the 2 women helped to bring about an end to the violence, actually, an end to the war, because it was so outlandish, you know, so shocking. You know, this kind of thing, it kind of brings alive, quote unquote, what Jesus says about persecution. You know, it's not that persecution is a good thing, that we should seek it, but he said, you will be persecuted. And if you're not, you're probably not proclaiming the truth. You're probably not denouncing injustice. You're probably not denouncing the sins of the rich and powerful and so forth. I guess what I wanted to say is that doesn't mean that it's not a good path in life. As I said, we celebrate these martyrdoms. I mean, if you participate in struggle, a little hope will be generated in you. If we don't participate in anything, if we just remain on the sidelines completely, passive in our little cocoon, our little island, no person is an island, but we try to be, that is not the way to a full human life, to fulfillment in this life. I hear people in Nicaragua, some people say, I can't watch the news. I don't watch it. It's all blood and ambulance chasing and murders going on, so I've stopped watching the news. Well, I don't think we can do that. It's one thing not to watch the news all day long, which I think some people here do. It's no wonder they get deeper. You don't have to watch the news all day long. I mean, it's to constantly be seeing the accidents, the murders, the nonsense that now is coming out in high circles. No, but you know, we got to know what's going on in this world in order to struggle with and for the people who are suffering. It's not a bad way of life. I think if we do come together and, as I said, analyze, see, judge, decide to act together, we're with people, we're with good people. You know, people of like mind, you share a lot. Love can express itself in service and or struggle. Jesus offers us happiness. Some people don't know that. But first of all, he said, I have come that they may have life, and life in abundance. I mean, not material abundance, but maybe at least sufficient to live on. But abundance in other ways. I've come that they may have life and have life in abundance. He said, I want my happiness to be your happiness. He said that, according to St. John at the Last Supper. After he had washed the feet of the disciples and was about to go to death on the cross, he's talking about happiness. It's paradoxical in a way, but it's better than a life just lived in the cocoon. Better than a life just lived on an island. Grown-up adults knock themselves out all day working to make lots of money so that they can buy new toys. Grown-ups, you know, working, that's all they want to do, buy new toys, cars, boats, houses, it seems like a very empty life, and I think it is. So Jesus said, I offer you happiness. I want my happiness to be your happiness. And then, but he had just washed their feet, and he was going to the cross. Why was he going to the cross? Because he denounced the leaders of the temple as thieves and hypocrites. You know that famous passage where Jesus is sitting in the temple? It's amazing to just imagine this. Jesus is sitting there in the temple, you know, kind of on the outskirts, just looking around, seeing what's going on. He's not part of the temple. He was not a priest. He was not a member of any of the power groups of the temple. He's sitting there, just observing what's going on. He's an outsider as far as the temple is concerned. And he sees this poor woman come. She makes her little offering, you know, and he says, this woman. Now, who else might notice that woman? Probably nobody. Jesus noticed people like that. And he said, now this woman has given more than all these rich people who give a lot more in absolute terms. Everybody knows that. The widow's mite, you know, M-I-T-E. What comes immediately before that, and you can check this out, is his concern about justice for these widows. Jesus denounces the scribes, the doctors of the law, for stealing the houses of widows. He said, you hide your thievery behind long robes and long prayers. So long prayers does not necessarily mean that a person is a good person or a follower of Jesus. That's why I say you can spend too much time in church. But basically it strikes me very strongly that he's not only recognizing and expressing his love for this poor widow, which sounds very nice, everybody's happy with that, but he has just denounced the causes, the structural causes of the injustice which she and other widows were suffering. The scribes were stealing their houses and hiding that injustice behind long robes and long prayers. So that's why Jesus was put to death. He was not put to death because he wanted to be or because he came to this earth for that. Some people say Jesus came to die. He came here to die for our sins. It doesn't make sense. He came here to combat sin and injustice and selfishness, to fight it by his teaching, by teaching other values, and by giving us the Holy Spirit so we have some help to change. That he was put to death because of that. He was put to death as a prophet, just like Romero, just like the Jesuits and the two women who were killed at the Uca in San Salvador. And I'll close with this. The proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus by the apostles were forbidden to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus. And they said we must obey God rather than men. What was so subversive and so troublesome to the power structure of Jerusalem about proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus? Well, it was not just proclaiming the resurrection of any old person. It's proclaiming the resurrection of this Jesus. St. Luke says in Acts of the Apostles, this Jesus who went around doing good and teaching and proclaiming the truth, this Jesus you turned over to the pagans. He's talking to the leaders of Jerusalem. You turned over to the pagans. Well, that was a very bad thing for a Jew to do, turn over a Jew to the pagans, to the Romans, to be killed, to be executed. Now this Jesus, God has raised from the dead. That's the edge. That's why it was considered subversive to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus, because they were saying in faith that God has raised up this Jesus whom you condemned and turned over to the Romans to be executed as a criminal on the cross. This Jesus, God has raised from the dead. Therefore, God has vindicated Jesus, and you were wrong. So that's why the authorities said, no more of this. You cannot proclaim the resurrection of Jesus.
So the first question is, what was your deciding factor to join the Jesuits?
To join the Jesuits?
Yeah.
I would say to explore seriously the mystery of God, and in a way to come to know Christ in a real way, and to be of service to people both materially and spiritually. Service in terms of preaching, teaching, celebrating Mass in a good way. I would hope to do that in a meaningful and joyful way. And when I joined, I didn't have a clearly defined sense of mission to work for justice, to get involved in these. That came a little later as part of my process of coming to know Jesus, coming to know the Gospels and the teachings of the Church, and seeing that as leading necessarily to involvement in struggles for social justice and peace.
Second question is, what is your greatest achievement so far?
Well, I would say my relationships with people in Nicaragua and other parts of, and here. I consider myself blessed and having received the grace of being kind of a people person, and this is a great gift to me, and having those relationships. Other things that I've done have given me satisfaction. I've been the in-country coordinator of the Jesuit volunteers in Nicaragua, but they were pulled out a few months ago because of the social unrest. But that gave me great satisfaction. And working with the Christian-based communities, as I've said, small groups of Christians meditating on Scripture, celebrating liturgy, and working with the disabled. I have a ministry to people with disabilities who give me a great deal of strength because of their struggles.
And the last question is, what would your advice today be to the youths that are going to grow up in this present world?
To love one another, to open ourselves to people, and not just a small clique or class of people, but to be open to people, especially people who are suffering, to organize, work together, form communities, to help others, and to struggle for a better world. It's a great life. And without that, I think we're just escaping from reality, and that wears pretty thin after a while.